The debt ceiling is supposed to expire. They're being talked about as a single issue, and you can say the same thing about the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare as well, because implementation was supposed to start on the 1st. It became this kind of thing that could be held hostage, but none of these issues actually are related to each other, besides their expiration or their timing. So the debt ceiling is the limit set by Congress on the total amount that the U.S. Treasury can borrow. Congress has legal authority and usually does raise the debt ceiling as needed without any problems. Doing so, it doesn't mean to authorize new spending, but it just means that the Treasury can pay the bills that it's already approved and that it's already been authorized by Congress. The federal deficit, I want to say, is different from the federal debt. The federal debt is the cumulative amount of money the government has borrowed throughout history, and both spending and revenues have contributed to the debt. The deficit, federal deficit is the amount of money that the federal government spends in a given year, minus the money it takes in. So if the government takes in more money than it spends in a year, but it's a surplus rather than a deficit. And we've been running on deficit for years now. I don't think we've had a surplus in decades. 2 decades. Spending, I also want to say, spending is not the main cause of the deficit, which is a big argument for some members of Congress. The combination of tax cuts and the recent economic downturn account for over 2/3 of the 10-year projected deficit. And the American Recovery Act, which was passed by President Obama in 2008, only accounts for 1/10 of the deficit. If you look at this chart, you can see that the Bush-era tax cuts are a big chunk of what's contributed to the deficit, as well as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that they're the biggest drivers, as opposed to the economic recovery measures that Obama passed in 2008, which are only 10% of it. So what's happening with the debt and the deficit? The federal debt stands at almost $17 trillion, which is right now, which is exactly the level of the current debt ceiling. The Treasury is expected to run out of cash by the end of the month, mid-month into the month, and without congressional action to raise the debt ceiling, the Treasury will be unable to pay all its bills. And why is this going on? So House Republicans are demanding, again, these unrelated policy changes to raising the debt ceiling instead of passing a clean bill that would just raise the debt ceiling. Republicans have said they won't allow an increase in the debt ceiling without some cuts to safety net or mandatory spending programs like Medicare and Social Security, changes to health care, tax and revenue-neutral tax reform that raises new revenue. The outcome, what would happen if we were actually to default on the debt? If the Treasury runs out of cash and is unable to borrow the money, it is going to default on its debt payments, as well as lapse on payments to government programs, such as Social Security, checks for retirees. A debt default by the U.S. government would have deeply, deeply negative impact on the global economy, with potential effects including higher unemployment, reduced value of retirement savings for retirees, higher interest rates on home and car loans for American consumers, and other repercussions. So we have to think about the repercussions of a debt default, as well as the impact of those human impacts of the shutdown, on top of the impacts that have already happened because of sequestration. And these all become compounded to this very, very tense moment that we're in right now and that Congress is in tonight. And they have to come up with a deal. So what can be done? We're of the mindset that this is gone, the shutdown has gone on too long. Sequestration needs to be replaced. And what can be done in the short term? Congress needs to pass a continuing resolution from the government and open it. They need to raise the debt ceiling so the government can borrow to pay the bills it already has. And they need to then have those serious discussions about what to do about the other issues going on in the budget, like these serious budget cuts of sequestration, and and go forward how to deal with those things after they take care of these very simple solutions. Now, latest development as of this afternoon, which is the same as tonight. The Senate revealed a plan that they would vote on, and I think they're voting right now, to reopen the government by extending the current funding of $986 billion through January 15th. So what that means is the Senate has accepted that that 986 number is the number of sequestration. It's not a good number, but what they're hoping is that if they take this level of spending, they can use the 3 months between now and January to negotiate a higher level of spending, which would be great if they could. The plan also lifts the debt ceiling until February 7th and opens a pathway for a budget conference so they can discuss a bigger budget deal that would hopefully deal with sequestration. And it requires strict efforts to do income verification for those who apply for subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. It does not permit the Treasury Department from using extraordinary measures when approaching a debt limit, so that means the debt ceiling would be raised. And it gives agencies more flexibility to deal with the automatic across-the-board spending cuts down to sequestration. This is an okay deal. It's not ideal, but they have maybe 24 hours to do something, so something is better than nothing. What we would hope is that by having a so-called bipartisan plan like this one, that they could go back and negotiate during these 3 months leading up to January 15th, so we're not in the same place on January 15th again, where we have another shutdown. What Friends Committee on National Legislation thinks a balanced approach to dealing with the budget looks like is that we need a budget plan and a replacement for sequestration that protects human needs in domestic and international programs, that restores lost revenues through a more progressive tax code, that makes investments in job creation, and that reduces planned Pentagon spending by $1 trillion over the next 10 years, which is actually the amount that sequestration proposes for the Pentagon. It is $500 billion in cuts to domestic spending and $500 billion in cuts to Pentagon spending, on top of the $500 billion cuts that have already been planned for the Pentagon, so that would equal $1 trillion over 10 years. It's this last portion of this kind of four balance principles approach that we have is probably the one that's the most unique to FCNL. A lot of the groups think that we can do a replacement package, or a lot of the groups that we work with on the Hill, and even members who've offered budgets think that we can do the whole thing on, say, just doing $1 trillion of tax increases and revenues. We think that this really is the balanced way. The Pentagon budget has ballooned over the past 10 years, and it needs to come down anyways. And I'll talk about it a little later. There's bipartisan support actually for $1 trillion cut in Pentagon spending. And it's so important that we include this last piece, because right now there are members on both sides who are trying to say we're going to keep the level of cuts of sequestration, but all we're going to do is shift it from the Pentagon and put more cuts on domestic. So that means they're okay with the cuts, they just want to shift the burden from Pentagon to domestic programs, which domestic programs have already paid their fair share, more than their fair share, in spending cuts. So how much do we actually spend on the military? So this is from the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research. Yeah, I got the acronym, I'm missing something, but so they do this report every year about states and countries with the highest military expenditures. And as you can see, we take up almost half of the world's military expenditures. The U.S. military budget dwarfs military spending of the next 29 biggest spenders, and we're about 7 times as much as China, which is our next biggest competitor. Like I was saying earlier, the Pentagon budget has grown and grown over the past 10 years, of course, because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And and we are not in a wartime now, and hopefully we will not be entering into another war. So this is an appropriate time for the Pentagon budget to come down. And there's actually this policy in place that's saying we can cut this $1 trillion from the Pentagon. So this is, I brought copies, hard copies of these flyers. This is a analysis that FCNL does every April about where our tax dollars go. And as you can see, for each dollar of federal income tax that we paid in 2012, the government spends on the dollar 37 cents on the dollar for the Pentagon, as opposed to the 15 cents on the dollar that we spend responding to poverty. So just to give you an idea about, the coin chart shows you proportionally how much more we spend on the military than other things, and so does the other chart. But just to talk in numbers a little bit about how big the actual Pentagon budget is. So in 2012 alone, the Pentagon's base budget was $530 billion. So when you combine that with the $130 billion that was spent on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it becomes almost $700 billion. And then when you take into consideration the Pentagon-related spending accounts and the Department of Energy, or in the foreign aid budget, because there are different Pentagon-related functions in these different agencies, then you get to a budget that's almost $1 trillion in 1 year, in 2012 alone. It has an extremely large budget. At FCNL, we're also unique in the fact that we do include the Pentagon spending in other agencies and not just in the Department of Defense in our analysis, because we think that's the way it should be done. If it's war spending in a different department, it's still war spending, and it's even written as such. There's a code, it's 050 code, that shows that it's money being spent for the Pentagon. So $1 trillion in 1 year, $1 trillion cut over 10 years, which is what we're advocating for. It's not that big. And so what do they possibly spend $1 trillion in 1 year on? So the Pentagon divides its budget into 3 main parts: personnel, weapons procurement, and operations and maintenance. Personnel is the biggest part of the budget. But the most problematic part of the budget, and the one where you can find the most savings, is in weapons procurement, and the really, really flashy, expensive weapon systems that the Pentagon continues to buy that happen to be inefficient and costly, but we still keep buying and buying and buying. I know a lot of times personnel, when we're hearing about sequestration in the military and defense budget in the news, a lot of it focuses on the cuts to personnel, military personnel. Well, what I would say to that is that it is a big part of rhetoric. The Pentagon has the flexibility to choose where to make the cuts. They do not have to cut personnel first. They could cut some of these weapon systems before, but they're choosing to, say, oh, we're going to have to furlough. It started off with respect to sequestration and not the shutdown. They eventually said they were going to have to furlough all DOD employees for 21 days. That was brought down to 16 days. Then they brought that down to 6 days. And then a couple months ago, they said, okay, only 4 days. So it's a lot of rhetoric and hype that's out there, when the top place that they should be looking to cut is in weapons procurement. The biggest poster child for waste, fraud, and abuse in the Pentagon budget is the F-35 strike fighter jet. Have you guys heard of the F-35? It's the Pentagon's most expensive weapon system to date. It has cost, since its inception in 2001, over the span of its lifetime, it's cost $1.5 trillion to build, fly, and maintain the F-35. So again, there's that trillion number coming up, which they just spent on a couple planes. And we're just asking $1 trillion over 10 years. The F-35 is plagued with so many inefficiencies. It's only operating at 12%. Even after 10 years, it's only operating at 12%.